doctoral student in the political science program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She works at Native Hawaiian Student Services, where she builds programming to support the NHSS mission and prepare students to contribute to a life-affirming and de-occupied future in Hawaii. Please join me in welcoming Ilima.
Aloha kākou. It's different for me to be in front of a room where I don't know hardly anybody, so that's kind of nice, but makes me kind of not sure what to expect. My name is Ilima Long, and like Iolani said, I'm a doctoral student in political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. But tonight, I'm actually presenting on my master's thesis work that Ihi saw me present on as part of kind of a political education series over the summer. So that is to say that this is not a topic that I've visited for quite some time, but it's been kind of neat to pick it back up after a few years and read through this and see just how actually relevant it is again. Just this past week, we're hearing news of Native women in Canada, going through actual, explicitly clear, eugenics procedures, coerced sterilization and things like that. But I think that the way you'll hear sort of tones of white supremacy, mixed in with sort of political power in this paper and presentation in ways that may very much resonate to right now as well. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to this topic. So my dad is Hawaiian. He's born and raised in Hilo. And my mom is white. She's from Seattle. And we were raised in the Seattle area. I'm one of 5. I'm the oldest of 5. And we were raised in a very sort of politically affirming region of the US. And one day I was in the Hawaiian General Store in the U District, which is this hokey little Hawaiian, kind of just knick-knack store. And they had this dusty, dark corner with books. And I saw a book, and it had this fierce Native woman on the front and people behind her, and it was called From a Native Daughter. And it was Haunani K. Trask. And I was like, that looks something about that. So I didn't know who she was. I didn't know anything. And I took that book home and I read it. And I was like, how come I did not know any of this? Why did my dad not tell me this? I can't believe with how political my family was and involved in all these different things, I never knew about this history. So not because of that, but because of other circumstances, I moved back to Hilo, which is where I was born, and to live with my grandma. And I end up going back to school, and I'm just learning so much, and I'm still just baffled by this question of of all the things we learned growing up, why didn't we learn this? And so in talking to some family members, and asking that question to my family, the response was, oh, well, it was shame to be Hawaiian when we were growing up. And I was like, what? That was another new thing to me. I didn't understand because there was no political shame in my life growing up. And then when I came back to Hawaii, of course, the era was totally different. This is in 2003, and I didn't see anybody around me that was ashamed to be Hawaiian, right? It was quite the opposite. So that sort of led me into looking at this period known as Territorial Hawaii, which follows the overthrow and the illegal so-called annexation of Hawaii. This period of transition from almost universal active resistance against annexation to the US to I'm not sure what until the Hawaiian Renaissance and the anti-eviction movements in Kaho'olawe in the 70s. So that I'm not sure what piece, I know that that's where some of the answers lie to what happened to these couple of generations following the overthrow. And it sort of led me to this topic. Let's see here. So I'm just gonna go through, I'm gonna do a little bit of background tonight on eugenics. I'm gonna give some context. a little bit of a picture of eugenics in Hawaii in the territorial period, but I'm mostly going to focus on a curriculum that was taught at Kamehameha Schools called Eugenics for Young People. So they were teaching about eugenics in a very particular way to, I think it's 6th, 7th, and 8th, or 5th, 6th, and 7th grade boys at Kamehameha Schools. And so some of this is kind of a close political reading of that text. Okay. So, brief background. The eugenics movement takes place in the US and Europe through most of the first half of the 20th century. A predominantly white, middle-class centered social movement toward race betterment. Those who subscribe to eugenics believe that the characteristics and traits that placed individuals socially and economically were biologically inherent and passed from one generation to the next. It was typically categorized into positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics aimed to increase the number of fit citizens through selective partnering and mating, and negative eugenics advocated for the elimination of the unfit through compulsory celibacy, sterilization, and institutionalization. You can see this certificate. You can, go get a eugenics certificate before you get married. You kind of go through some kind of, you go to a doctor and you get checked out. And if you are considered kind of fit to reproduce or ideal, then you can get a eugenics certificate. And laws were passing throughout the United States that required this sort of assessment before you could get married. And then, of course, there's the negative side of like sterilization and things like that. Indiana was the first state to legalize compulsory sterilization in 1907 and was followed by 29 states in the coming decades. The eugenics movement included legislation, literature, curriculum, fitter family campaigns, networks of eugenics societies, speeches and conferences, exhibits, and social fitness awards. It included educational, social, legal, and criminal justice institutions. The Territorial Hawaii eugenics movement adds its own chapter to the broader story of eugenics. Whereas American eugenics largely addressed perceived threats to white supremacy within the borders of the United States, such as immigration or women starting to gain more independence and sexual freedoms, and that was sort of seen as like a threat to the race. The story of eugenics in Hawaii signifies an ideological campaign that served to justify conquest and seizure of land, of nationhood, and of national identity itself as the U.S. extended its imperial reach outward. So eugenics was introduced in Hawaii at a meeting of the Social Science Society of Hawaii in Honolulu in 1886. This is the first thing that I can find, the first trace of eugenics dialogue or anything that I can find. The Social Science Society of Hawaii was a social club of primarily white male elites founded in 1882 that served to both share essays and modern thoughts on issues of race and science and governance, as well as to inform and influence policy in Hawaii. While the first trace of dialogue around eugenics that I found was a paper read in 1886, just simply exploring what is eugenics. Eugenics didn't gain traction as a movement or start to push for policy change in Hawaii until over 2 decades later, on the cusp of the American movement. Okay. So, however, at an 1888 meeting, and these dates are kind of significant too, because the eugenics paper exploring what it is 1886. That's the year before Bayonet Constitution. And then this paper is read the next year after Bayonet. So somebody should pick up that thread and do some research around that as well. But missionary descendant Reverend Sereno E. Bishop read an essay authored by himself titled, "Why Are the Hawaiian People Dying Out?" In his essay, he aimed to answer the question, and this is in his essay, in what respects, particularly and precisely, are the Hawaiians weaker than their white and their Mongoloid guests? Okay, and so here's all his, oh no, I don't have all his reasons. Okay. The answers included unchastity, on which he spent the majority of his essay pointing to as the cause of Hawaiian weakness. Other reasons, according to Bishop, included drunkenness, oppression of the chiefs, kahuna and sorcery, and idolatry. Bishop offered hygiene instruction, Christianity, and education as some things that could save the dreadful fate of the Hawaiians. This was typical of the society's interest in race, and in particular, its relationship to governance in Hawaii. It also exemplified the continuity of missionary discourses that positioned Oiwi cultural practices, such as ho'omana kahiko, or like pre-Christian religious practices, as Hawaiians' own worst enemy, as that which would drive them to extinction. So, kind of going back now, panning back out to the US and getting into the early 1900s, birth rate differentials between the white middle class and non-white populations, increasing immigration, and the belief that the best of the white stock were being sent off and sacrificed to war raised racial anxieties for some white Americans at the turn of the 20th century. These anxieties were expressed through the idea of race suicide, which became a rallying cry for some supporters of eugenics. The notion of race suicide was embedded in a belief in the racial and cultural superiority of whites and in a fear that the political control entitled to a superior race was threatened by a growing non-white population. Sounds familiar. And this seemed very foreign to me, like when I wrote this. Now it doesn't. Subscribers to the notion of race suicide believed that it was the responsibility of the best of the white race to reproduce with each other in order to maintain such superiority. Theodore Roosevelt, who was president from 1901 to 1909, was one such proponent of the idea of race suicide and would talk about it in speeches and whatnot. As Wendy Klein explains, juxtaposing his imperialist foreign policy with an attack on race suicide at home, he argued that, quote, no race has any chance to win a great place in the world unless it consists of good breeders as well as good fighters. Roosevelt felt that a good and strong white race was critical to US power in the world. In this sense, whiteness was critical to US imperialism, and US imperial power was equally critical to whiteness in the US. While the US had invaded Hawaii to establish it as a military outpost, that was one of the benefits of it. The population of Hawaii as primarily non-white would be a challenge that those wanting full inclusion into the United States would need to overcome. If the population could not be made white, perhaps they could be made to reflect the values and lifestyles. Okay. So back to the territory of Hawaii, territorial reports reveal that the racial makeup of Hawaii was of utmost concern to both territorial and US officials. The 1903 report of the governor of Hawaii to the US Secretary of Interior opens, the very first thing in this report, with the racial makeup of Hawaii, including Hawaiian, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, Scandinavian, Spanish, and Teutonic, which includes British, German, and American. It then reports that Hawaiian, Portuguese, Japanese, and Chinese school children outnumber Teutonic children by 14,724, noting that, quote, almost all of the boys, speaking to these non-white boys, non-Teutonic boys, will be voting citizens when they reach voting age. The report then communicates the territorial government's anxieties over political implications of these numbers, stating, quote, at this rate, unless there should be a larger immigration of American settlers than now seems probable, the present numerical inferiority of those which may be classed as belonging to the Teutonic race will in a few years become a still greater inferiority as compared with the then American citizens of the Hawaiian, Portuguese, Japanese, and Chinese races. And they really conflate like race and nationality in this, but it kind of shows also, you know, sort of racial configurations that are happening during this time as well. The report offers its solution to such political conflict, stating, quote, this prospect emphasizes the importance of giving all children who are American citizens a good common school education. The association of pupils of the different races with each other in school, work, and recreations of the playground go far toward breaking down racial prejudices and tends to prepare them for intelligent political action in the future. Now, this is really interesting to me because it sounds like they are, sort of forwarding this multicultural, they all need to kind of know each other, have a common education, and get along. But we also know that, during this early time in the territory, they were pitting races against each other in terms of the sugar workforce, the labor workforce. And it was the unions like IBEW and other unions that started doing the anti-racism work for them to come together, for workers to come together against the bosses. So I'm proposing that there's, a political interest in getting all of these school children to, sort of blend their identities together as American kids. While this report comes nearly a decade prior to the establishment of the eugenics movement in Hawaii, it reveals racial and national concerns of those who governed Hawaii, and that would shape policy and social efforts in the coming decades. National concerns over race suicide in the future of the US, popularized in the first decade of the 20th century, largely shaped the American eugenics movement that took off thereafter. The territorial oligarchy wished to secure power by encouraging Americans to consider Hawaii for permanent settlement, but knew that their own, Americans' own, racial anxieties about Hawaii would also be an issue for them. The social effects of disease and urbanization in Hawaii created even greater image problems for those who supported American settlerism in Hawaii, and such themes were prominent in talks on eugenics given to the Medical Society of Hawaii that immediately preceded an organized effort to institutionalize eugenics in Hawaii. So the Medical Society was one of the primary institutions of support for territorial eugenics movement, and I don't have the picture with me right now, but the Medical Society, you recognize a lot of the names. Sanford B. Dole is one of them. So there's folks that were involved in the overthrow, and this becomes another one of these sort of territorial institutions that are all sort of overlapping together. Yeah, okay. So they have an annual meeting in 1911, the Medical Association of Hawaii. I'm sorry, that's a little bit small. A physician named John T. McDonald gives a talk called The New Science of Eugenics. And he is a self-described eugenist who says he's a eugenist as arriving at a knowledge of proper qualifications and requirements for parenthood, with a view always to a better and worthier race by the gradual elimination of the unfit. So he gives a talk to the Medical Society, and he is the one that kind of first introduces to this audience this concept of unfitness. And the way that he goes into describing, these are all sort of the categories of unfitness that he's talking about. So he names these, and with the exception of the recovering alcoholic, because he says that in a really long-winded way, these are all his words. So he asked the audience to question whether or not thieves, embezzlers, chronic gamblers, the drunkard, the previous drunkard who now abstains, but because they had a problem before, epileptics, the feeble-minded, the congenital deaf, the degenerate, criminals, and paupers should be allowed to reproduce or not. And the focus of the problem that he's posing is the financial burden that they pose on society. And he makes an argument that governments could save millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, if they didn't have to support the problems that come with these types of people. So he says that their cost to society, he emphasizes their cost to society and the possibility that they transmit their mental traits to their offspring. So these are social issues, but that through the eugenics discourse are being framed as, biological issues, basically, that issues of genetics, although that's not the thing yet. So he says that eugenics would bear its greatest fruit upon the great toiling masses. Especially in the crowded tenement quarters of our great cities do we find high birth rates and, we may add, a correspondingly high death rate. So in Hawaii, such a lens would bring particular attention to Hawaiian families who found the effects of urbanization and industrialization the cause of major economic hardship. As Daviana Pomaika'i McGregor's research highlights, in 1910, over a third of Kanaka lived in urban Honolulu. That's a crazy number. And by 1920, the number had increased to 42%, with 28% of those unemployed Hawaiian. The numbers continued to grow, and in 1930, 40% of those unemployed were Hawaiian. She explains that following the 1900 burning of Chinatown tenements, hundreds of Hawaiian families were driven to build makeshift shelters. The high cost of fish and poi in Honolulu, as well as the burden of rent and other living expenses, left many Oiwi families in poverty. McGregor notes that a 1912 Pacific Commercial Advertiser survey that identified squatter camps along the shoreline near Fort Armstrong, near Ala Moana between Ward and Sheridan Streets, under Diamond Head and at the base of Round Top, at Moana Lua and near Iwilei. With the exception of one camp, Hawaiian families made up the bulk of the inhabitants. Eugenicists advocated for the reproductive sterilization of such individuals as the means of lessening the economic burden of this group of people. Unfit became the catch-all label for those targeted by negative eugenics. Within 2 years of McDonald's talk, eugenics had gained significant support in Hawaii. In 1913, 2 eugenics bills were introduced into the legislature, and a curriculum was implemented at the Kamehameha Schools specifically for Hawaiian boys and girls. So I will touch on some of those other eugenics efforts at the end, but we're going to kind of dive into the curriculum at Kamehameha Schools now. Okay, so in 1913, students at Kamehameha Schools, and this publication was produced or was published through the Medical Society of Hawaii that I had referenced. So they were all about it, and they made possible the production of this curriculum. So in 1913, students of Kamehameha Schools were introduced to a eugenics textbook called Eugenics for Young People that used ancestry as a lens through which to determine their own degree of moral and civic ineptitude, honestly, and the resulting future of their family lines. It's important to keep in mind that these 6th and 7th graders of Kamehameha Schools who would receive instruction on eugenics were the first born under US occupation. And at home, they were being raised by those Hawaiians who so actively and vocally opposed the takeover of Hawaii by the US and the Haole oligarchy. And other work has been done on the public school systems, like American indoctrinating curriculum, and this kind of takes a related aspect of that into the private school, but the private school that is full of Hawaiians. These Kanaka youth were growing up on the cusp of political revolution, social upheaval, and an ongoing contestation, one that continues today, for Hawaii's future. Eugenics for young people was, let's get all these up here. Of course I knew that. Eugenics for Young People was comprised of 12 short chapters and was written by then Vice President of Kamehameha Schools, Uldrich Thompson. Thompson, educated in the US, was a teacher by trade. He had a number of teaching positions in the US before coming to Hawaii in 1889 as a teacher for Kamehameha Schools. Ethnomusicologist C.K. Sego, who studied Thompson's musical compositions about Pele, points to Thompson's racial ambivalence towards Oiwi, and that's a term that I use for Kanaka Maoli, for Native Hawaiians, explaining that, quote, "It was largely a matter of fascination with Hawaiians who were safely in the past and a condemnation of the majority of their stigmatized and very present children." He goes on to say that it is also fair to say that Thompson's feelings of ambivalence towards Hawaiians were held by many others in his social position. He admired Hawaiians' past greatness and the ability to adapt to European American lifeways, but he was aghast at those who floundered in a Christian capitalist democracy or shunned it altogether. Eugenics for young people was implemented as a regular subject in the 1912-1913 school year and was taught once a week to 5th, 6th, and 7th grade boys. Later, it would be made part of the girls' curriculum, but I could not find when in the journals of the Kamehameha Schools archives. One Sunday evening a month, a short paper was read to all the boys, reviewing points brought about during the month. It included all the major themes of eugenics, including fixed degeneracy, the burden and elimination of the unfit, and emphasized particular social ideals as the antithesis to unfitness. While using science to fix unfitness as biologically inherent, the text nevertheless provided students an out to the natural outcome of this legacy, which is extinction, and that out was good citizenry. This is where, I think this is like super interesting. Okay, so the first chapter, titled Eugenics, explains what eugenics is. And this is written by, I already said that, Ulrich Thomsen. So it situates the emerging field of eugenics within other established sciences as an attempt to legitimize its authority. Its ability to predict the quality of a person is compared to chemistry, which the text explains informs people what will happen when men put two substances together. And sociology, which according to the text informs people what will happen when people live under certain conditions. Thomsen elaborates on the definition of sociology and then replaces the term entirely with eugenics, stating that, quote, "But I shall not call it sociology, because sociology is too big a subject. I shall call it eugenics." Not sure how scholarly that is, but all right. So in replacement, kind of convoluting the two, Thomsen's analysis and explanation of sociology becomes a most informative framework for the rest of the text. So this is where, you've probably all already read it, but that is if you tell a sociologist just what kind of people live in a country or in a city or in a part of a city, how much they're educated, how much they earn, how many saloons there are, etc., he will tell you what will happen in that country or city. Sociology means the study of people, their nationality, their mental and physical powers, their training, their social conditions, and then I highlighted this, whether they are capable of becoming good citizens, and whether their children will become better citizens or poorer citizens than the fathers and mothers. And we have to keep in mind again, like who this generation of kids were. Sociology is also a study of how to improve human beings in every way. Oh yeah, then he says it there. But I shall not call it sociology because I'm just going to do whatever I want, so I'm going to call it eugenics. All right. Thomsen emphasized that the study of eugenics is the study of the quality of nationhood as determined by the quality of its citizenry. So the characteristics and conditions that Thomsen lays out in the following chapters are presented as binaries of worthy American citizenry and those of the unfit, which were inclusive of particular social and economic realities of many Hawaiians at the time. The looming threat of elimination for those considered unfit would frame good citizenry as the path to survival. And mere survival was presented to the children of Kamehameha Schools above all else in the curriculum as the primary concern for the Lahui Hawaii. The logic of future extinction depended upon a very specific perspective of the past that positioned the Oiwi youth of 1913 not only as a biological legacy of degeneracy, but also as without a legacy of citizenry and nationhood of their own. In the second chapter of Eugenics for Young People, Thomsen begins the discussion on biological determinism by explaining that, quote, "In most of us, the good qualities of one ancestor have combined with the bad qualities of another ancestor. This makes us not so good as our best ancestors." So I don't think it's coincidental that ancestry is the terminology that's being used for him to teach these kids about who they are and in relation to, fitness or unfitness. Okay. The fourth chapter of Eugenics for Young People, entitled To a Remnant, gives shape and meaning to the concept of the best ancestor as introduced earlier in the text. This section offers particular characteristics as those of the best ancestor, setting a standard through which Kanaka students are to measure their kupuna and themselves, stating that, quote, "Hawaiians possessed many of the finest qualities mankind is heir to. It is shown by what they did." Thomsen then lists a number of the finest qualities, along with the practices that exemplified the qualities. And I've turned this into a table, but he just kind of lists them out. So we have gigantic in stature and great in strength, as evidenced by their spears and surfboards. The quality of courageousness, as evidenced by their voyages in open canoes, thousands of miles without compass or chart, their battles in sport, plunging from the canoe underneath a 15-foot shark with only a rude knife in hand. Patience and preserving, maybe that's perseverance. The carving they did, the kapa, the wonderful feather cloaks. They were industrious, the terraces and irrigating systems they left. Honest and hospitable, testified by every visitor in early days, and intelligent, as evidenced by Hawaiian mele. Through the lens of degeneracy, as introduced earlier in the textbook, the students are assumed to be less strong, less courageous, and less intelligent than generations before. Additionally, the idea of the best ancestor is confined to characteristics that pose no threat to American political control, but that rather exemplify an idealized symbol of the Hawaiian of the past, that which many Americans found exotic and fascinating as they gained greater exposure to Hawaii in this period. Any mention of the creation of governance, of traditional governing institutions, of the creation of a constitutional monarchy, the degree of citizen engagement and discourse and participatory democracy, not to mention the monumental organized protest of the citizens and ali'i to defend political independence at the end of the 19th century, of course, is entirely absent as examples of courage, patience, perseverance, and intelligence. So nowhere is 19th century anything mentioned in this curriculum except in one spot, which I'm about to get to. These things made up the rich national heritage of the Kamehameha School students of 1913. The only reference to the Hawaiian Kingdom era that Eugenics for Young People in it is a not so subtle reference to the extinction of the ali'i lines. In the section of Eugenics for Young People entitled The Elimination of the Unfit, Thompson writes, "Look about you. Everywhere you see lines becoming extinct through the slow-moving, merciless laws of nature. Such elimination has come to members of the strongest lines, and such elimination may come to members of your line, unless." And the text literally leaves off unless with a dash like that, like unless. You okay, Joy? I told you this is gonna be. So here Thompson reinforces the idea of extinction, and by mention of the strongest lines, taps into an Oiwi epistemological reference to ali'i lines. The mo'okuauhao of ali'i were considered a part of the Oiwi national heritage and governance structures. In the 19th century, many ali'i did in fact die without having reproduced due to diseases, while many others, though, did live on. To highlight the extinction of these particular lines in Eugenics for Young People served as a metaphor for the extinction of Oiwi national heritage. Okay. Going back to chapter 4, to a remnant. Let's see. Following the description of the best ancestor, Thompson draws a clear line between the students and the best ancestor, stating, quote, "Where now are those men of strength and endurance, of courage, of perseverance? Most of that stock was killed off in the wars, or died from disease and drink introduced by the white man. Worst of all, most of them died without having reproduced their kind, and humanity is just that much poorer." Eugenics doctrine promotes the reproduction of only the best and highest quality of the race. The message to the children is that the good Hawaiians or best ancestors are non-existent. In other words, no matter how high the quality of their ancestors, these children are far from it. Where mo'okuauhao maintained intergenerational continuity, the chronological gap presented in Eugenics for Young People between the students of 1913 and the best ancestor exemplifies how eugenics discourse was rooted in the difference and separation between a person and their ancestor. While personal or national genealogical connections between Oiwi and their kupuna of the Hawaiian Kingdom era were omitted, it was filled with another defining component of that era to construct the idea of degeneracy, and that is disease. The magnitude to which Oiwi had been devastatingly affected by foreign disease would make disease and its stigmatization as a measure of degeneracy A powerful enforcement, if not virtual proof, for Thompson's argument that these students were only a remnant in terms of both quantity and quality of their ancestors. In terms of political control, a narrative of degeneracy served to situate the loss of power by the Hawaiian Kingdom as a gradual fall of a people rather than an event of armed seizure. It also served to naturalize control of Hawaii by Haole as merely a transfer of governance to a stronger race capable of advancement. Okay, so in another section titled Environment, Thompson, he just listed out, I made it into a chart for clarity, but he lists favorable environments and unfavorable environments. And now, so this is the other side where he starts to like present like what you want to strive for, but also in doing so kind of causes reflection of these students to think about, well, where does my family fit into this, right? So favorable environments, clean and comfortable home as opposed to unpleasant home that does not attract children. And then thinking again of like the tenements that were, set up at this time. Friends with good ideals as opposed to friends who are coarse and have bad habits. That's all my friends. Wholesome food and plenty of it. Food is not well prepared. I'm sure someone could just do a whole thing on just that right there too. Well-trained to some kind of work, too little food, find employment in a place where the air is good, surroundings are clean and sanitary, and the hours are not too long, as if that's just, a measure of your merit where you end up working. So as opposed to children who are allowed to spend too much time on the street instead of being in school, children allowed to begin work too early, work in a place where air is bad and hours are long. And then he specifically points out the qualities of the middle and upper classes. So in it, the text says, why do the middle and upper classes take so much trouble with their children? And so the middle and upper class are taught principles of industry and honesty as opposed to a child who has a gutter for a playground. Middle and upper class are clean and sober rather than having a saloon for its nursery. Send children to school and college as opposed to a factory. And having a drunkard for its example, thief for its teacher, to keep them morally clean and prepare them for a useful life, as opposed to cannot expect them to be clever and moral and thrifty and clean and sober. Okay. So Noi Goodyear Kaupua specifically addresses the ways in which eugenics served class construction and identification at Kamehameha. She says, it was during the first few decades of the 20th century that KS pedagogies more distinctly aimed to produce a middle class, civil service labor force of Hawaiians, differentiating them from the poor and more marginalized segments of Hawaiian society. Thompson's urgings against the reproduction of the unfit was an essential part of making differentiations among Kanaka Maoli and of educating a Hawaiian middle class to collaborate with white elites. These American middle-class norms were also a reiteration of Christian salvation, and Goodyear Kaupua states that the pedagogies of KS during this period constructed the Lahui as a race, defined by its fragility and peril. By emphasizing supposedly inherent weaknesses in the Hawaiian race, KS administrators legitimized pedagogical intervention, saving a dying race through the cultivation of Christian morals and American cultural and political affinities, which is something that the missionaries had been sort of working to do since they got here, but did not have the power to just lay it out for all of the kids to the degree that these administrators had at this time. So adopting these social and moral ideals were presented as a pathway for survival for OEV, as a race on a natural path toward extinction. So going back to the section 9 entitled The Elimination of the Unfit, Thompson juxtaposes nature's method of elimination to science's method. So science is used as a euphemism for medicalized sterilization, and nature seems to mean anything else that could possibly lead to a person's varying degrees of misfortune, but presumably death. So pointing again to what are actually issues of political marginalization and social economics, he defines cold, hunger, unemployment, and even unemployability as nature's method to eliminate the unfit, deeming each of these conditions as natural, fixed, and distant from larger political structures or bodies. According to Eugenics for Young People, charities, hospitals, and asylums were institutions where degenerates and the unfit are found, exemplifying the belief that degeneracy was incorrigible and that ultimately the money spent on the unfit through these institutions was a burden on society and a great argument for sterilization. He then both emphasizes his horror at the thought of having a degenerate in his family and normalizes sterilization by casually stating that, quote, "If one of my line shall become degenerate, either through accident or through some foolish act of his own, I want science to end that part of my line right there." And right there is bolded in the text. Awesome. Okay. As an authoritative voice to the students, he's positioning sterilization as the most logical and rational choice upon the sign of degeneracy within one's own family. With a population collapse of between 87 and 95%, it can be assumed that stories of reproductive sterility and death were carried in the families of many of these OEV youth. Not only is Thompson making light of a source of great historical trauma, but he is offering death and extinction as a form of salvation, that OEV lines would be saved through the death of their own family members. Bringing greater focus to the capitalist center through which unfitness was to be measured, Thompson then poses the question. You're gonna love this. Okay. What is your wish for the unfortunate ones that may come in your line, you who believe in the present system of laissez-faire? Like, what? These kids, like, they're like, what? Finding oneself as a contributor to unbridled capitalism is positioned here as the measure of human fitness and worthiness of life itself. It is unclear whether or not the young haumana of Thompson's class even knew what laissez-faire meant or free market capitalism was. But when they did learn what it was clearly the framework through which they were expected to understand the future of Hawaii and the value of Kanaka. Okay, almost done. As noted above, the very beginning of Eugenics for Young People, Thompson emphasizes the value of eugenics in terms of analyzing citizenry. He positions eugenics as determining whether people are capable of becoming good citizens, of whether their children would become better or poorer citizens than their fathers or mothers. While the issue of citizenry is stressed at the beginning of this text, Thompson's analysis of the OEV student's best ancestor lacks any hint of quality citizenry or even mention of citizenship as a component of Hawaiian at all, right? So citizenship even belongs to like this American kind of thought. It's as if it wasn't a big deal already to Hawaiians in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Excluding citizenry from this era and instead emphasizing disease and degeneracy with a focus on extinguished ali'i mo'oku'auhau continually reinforce narratives of OEV extinction. While the outcome of the fixed and irreparable nature of degeneracy is repeatedly established as extinction, Thompson does provide the students with the possibility of tapping into the qualities of their best ancestor. The following quote is a little bit lengthy, but it's a vivid illustration of how mo'oku'auhau, or ancestry, was manipulated and seemed intended to make the OEV students feel both ashamed of their degenerate past and hopeful that as a remnant, some aspects of their ancestry might help them become good American citizens as they're on their path to survival. So this is kind of one of the closing thoughts in Eugenics for Young People. So the text reads, "It is idle perhaps to inquire if the old-time Hawaiians could have adapted themselves to these new conditions. I believe they could have done so because they had the necessary qualities. Only the modern training of those qualities would have been necessary, but they are gone, and these noble and necessary qualities latent in the remnant left. We see young women and young men of Hawaiian blood who are meeting the new conditions and holding their own in the struggle for existence and advancement. And this suggests that the qualities that made up the old-time Hawaiians, or that made the old-time Hawaiians great in their time and under their conditions, have been transmitted and are still in the blood, latent, if you will, but present and capable of development. Perhaps not in all, for disease has decreased both vitality and, with vitality, the possibility of development. But in many there is possibility. The demand for the development of these qualities and the opportunities for their development are both present. It remains for this remnant of a great people to learn how best to keep and how best to transmit to their children the qualities that they are proud to say their ancestors possessed. And they must learn these things and act upon this knowledge before it is everlastingly too late. So I'll go ahead and leave it right there, actually, and move on to this kind of last segment here. I think I overly explained and repeated myself over and over kind of the impact of, or the potential impact and the work that curriculum served to do. So a little bit on some of the other components of eugenics in Territorial Hawaii. So in 1913, 2 eugenics bills are introduced. So one is for that marriage license, to have to get pre-screened before you can get marriage and be determined fit. And then the other one, the bill was called for the sterilization of feeble-minded persons, epileptics, rapists, certain criminals, and defectives. So at this time, the territorial legislature were all men, and they were either Hawaiian or they were white. And with the exception of one Hawaiian, the votes were split down the middle, with Hawaiians voting no on these bills and whites voting yes. There was, I forget where it was now, but there's a description somewhere. I think it's actually in the newspaper, because the newspapers would have just little, summaries of the legislative activities of the day. And in one of the newspapers, it said that one of the Hawaiian legislators, Sheldon, spoke passionately in Hawaiian before they took the vote on the sterilization bill. And then they took the vote, and this was kind of the product of it. By this time, Hawaiian language and Hawaiian speeches in the territorial legislature are no longer being recorded. And he knew that, so he was obviously specifically trying to speak to the Hawaiians. And I just cannot find what he said. I want to know so bad what he said. I'm wondering if they're making the connections between eugenics and the stigmatization around leprosy and Hansen's disease, and what Hawaiians had been through, and perhaps we're still going through with that. So neither of those bills passed. Okay, in 1915, let's help the parents understand eugenics. So a supplementary curriculum came out of Kamehameha Schools, also through the Medical Association of Hawaii, called Eugenics for Parents and Teachers. And it's pretty similar to the other one. So this is pretty interesting too. In 1920, Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded. Do all the folks who've been around Hawaii for a while, did you know that that's the full name of it? Yeah, Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded. So that was a whole process of folks coming in from the US and doing all these surveys and looking at, incarcerated peoples and talking and collaborating with other institutions in the territory. And they set aside the money in the territorial legislature for the Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded. And this actually ended up being they called the patients there prisoners? Yeah. Inmates, thank you, inmates. They called them inmates. So this was a place to basically incarcerate the unfit as well. And then there's a piece here where a lot of women were being sent there who were busted for prostitution or sexual deviancy of whatever sorts. So there's this whole string to pull out of this story too about the racialized sexual constructions of Hawaiian men and Hawaiian women in the territorial period as well. And then there's a really great master's thesis available that just talks all about Waimano Home. And Waimano Home was not just incarcerating Hawaiians, it was incarcerating Japanese, Filipinos maybe, I forget, I have it in my thesis, the chart, but it was, it was a multiracial, multicultural effort, that one. In 1933, another sterilization bill is backed by the director of Queens Hospital, Palama Settlement, Deputy Attorney General, the Board of Prison Directors, and Superintendent of Waimano Home. So this is just interesting to see like all of the institutions that were kind of behind this kind of thing. And I don't think any of the sterilization bills passed in the territory, but it just shows that there was like this continual movement. Okay, I don't have it up here, but I think the last sterilization bill is put forward in the 50s or in like 1950 or something like that. And that one is also defeated. Yeah. Okay, so I just kind of threw this up there as like placeholders, but there's a lot of, I've, kind of moved on from this topic. I'm gonna ask Iolani to come up here and speak for 10 minutes in a second. She's an undergraduate in ethnic studies that is kind of picking up this research, and I asked her to talk about some of the stuff that she's looking at. There's a lot of threads to pull out here. Of course, we know that Stanley Porteous was, a eugenicist researcher at the University of Hawaii, and looking at not just that, but sort of the relationship between the academy and science and the subjugation of Native peoples. This is, that could be a framework for looking at this eugenics issue. And I think that that even does tie to the TMT right now as well, just in terms of the university going against Native peoples in the name of research. Of course, there's like a huge assimilative process happening here. Thinking about the genealogy of incarceration of folks in Hawaii, like eugenics can be brought into that conversation and research more as well. And then just like you can take so many aspects of just the eugenics movement itself, and there's a lot to pick up. So eugenics is sort of, I think, an understudied topic in terms of eugenics in Hawaii, but that is also situated with the most understudied era in Hawaii, which is the territorial period. I need better language for that period, but that's all I got. So Ihi, do you mind coming up for a couple minutes and just talking a little bit about what you're doing? Yeah? And then we'll close and open it up for discussion. So she's the future of eugenics research. So this is like the official, here you go, girl.
Oh, aloha mai kakou. My name is Iolani Palace. I'm from Manoa, and I'm part of the OEV Undergraduate Research Fellowship at UH Manoa. So how you got into this fellowship was you pitched an idea that you wanted to research, and then you got selected. So thank you to Ilima for selecting me and having faith in me to continue this research. So what really got me started and interested in eugenics and education was in high school. I worked for the Kamehameha Schools archives, and there was so much information that I didn't have access to, but what I did learn was that from December 7, 1941, for 2 years, the Kamehameha Schools actually stopped educating people, and it's not citizens, but it's students. So women were in charge of being nurses, so in the dormitories, and men were in charge of being a part of the military. So I was interested in seeing how the conditions of their education system influenced them. And then looking into the definition of eugenics and education, it's the science of improving the human population by controlled breeding and increasing the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics. So what really interested me is stretching that definition of eugenics, and it's not just heritable physical characteristics, but the way you can condition someone's mind. And so the way I'm trying to work through this process of eugenics and education is the conscious and unconscious effort in shaping minds and bodies through the education system in favor of colonialism and whiteness. And so furthering onto that, it's what we learn is what we internalize. and what we internalize is what we are. So how does what we learn impact and influence us more than what happens in our homes? So the idea of everything starts at home, I think, is very true, but the fact that who you are really stays with you through your education system is equally as important. Does that make sense? It's something I'm very much still working through. It's one of my newer projects. Actually, it's my only project. I'm only a sophomore, so. So moving on to that, I'm an ethnic studies major with a focus in indigenous politics, which is why I'm so passionate about this research. And something that I really wanted to do with this project was holding the University of Hawaii accountable to the way that they use eugenics and education to influence the minds of the students that they're teaching. So this is both within their curriculum as well as physically the mapping of the University of Hawaii and how eugenics is centered on the ways like our bodies move throughout the university system. So something I'm looking into is the physical mapping. So why is the University of Hawaii a school of Hawaiian knowledge, and yet Hawaii Nui Ake as a completely separate entity, like all the way on the other end of Dole Street, and really what are the values, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, what are the values of UH and how are they implemented through their education system? Thank you. Cool. Does anyone have any questions on research? It's very much like in its beginning stages, but that's something I'm really interested in doing.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, there's a massive archive. There's a massive archive in the UH archives on Stanley Porteous alone and his, research and stuff like that, and that whole center that they had going on there. And then I know that we're finding some photos of, I think it's like graduation pictures, like the class that's graduating in the early days of UH, and they're on the bleachers in like a racial hierarchy. The whites on the top bleacher, Hawaiians on the bottom. I think Chinese are kind of up top and Japanese, and anyways, it's kind of nuts. So that UH piece is like another whole just project. And I think also like historicizing KS and like, getting real about Kamehameha Schools' just place in this history, in this complicated history. Yeah, so thank you very much. And if folks have questions or want to talk story, I guess now's the time. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a quick question. Struck me as this is happening at the same time there's this big social movement to alleviate the suffering of the conditions of poor people. Like Jacob Reese in New York had all those terrible pictures about tenements. The purpose was to let people be aware of the terrible conditions that people have been forced into, and to alleviate that, including creating city parks and this sort of thing, which everybody who's wealthy had access to that sort of thing, but the poor did not. In other words, it's you got to make the assets available to these people, and they will then take care of their lives, and you don't have to think about exterminating them, kind of thing. That's all going on, and yet this eugenics movement is going on at the same time. You pointed out something there in 1933 that the sponsors of sterilization were the same people who were trying to alleviate the suffering of the poor Palama settlement. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so one thing I don't talk about at all is like, well, was anybody sterilized? So those records in my master's research, like I just didn't get to. I kind of tried, but I probably, if I would have gone longer, I could have found them. But Palama settlement, I think, is one of the places in what I did see where sterilizations were happening. And I think private doctors were able to. So it was, this compulsory sterilization was not legal, was not like allowed through the law, but that was like state compulsory sterilization. I think private sterilization was going on, but that needs to be picked up in terms of research, yeah.
Just a question though, because Palama settlement mirrored Hull House in Chicago. Yeah. And it was a religious movement where I didn't read anything, at least in Hull House, that there was the sterilizations going on. And if Palama was supposed to be mirroring off the mothership, if you will, I had not picked up on that one. And so it was kind of, it's not to say it didn't happen, but the Hull House modeled it.
If I take down this presentation and turn off the projector, I can go find, because this is just some parts, but I can go into my thesis and find, I forget his name, but there's like the director of Palama Settlement at the time. That might be like the point of,
Yeah, it's the rep.
that doesn't
And
sound
they
familiar.
still have the family members that are like monitoring the archives. You know, and she was a.
Oh, so where are the archives now?
You know, talk to Paula Rath. And
Paula
Linda,
Rath?
you'd know, because
They-
she
I
took
don't know
over
if
the archives from
their
her mom.
archives was at Palama Settlement. I don't know if it's been moved.
You know, I don't know.
It's still there.
But she's like the steward, the caretaker.
Yeah, she's still alive.
Yeah, yeah. She was a former writer for the Honolulu Advertiser.
Yeah. I never
Okay,
heard
so
that
the
about
names
Palama.
associated with the supporters of that 1933 bill are Dr. Nils Larson, Medical Director of Queens Hospital, Dr. Philip S. Platt, Director of Palama Settlement, E.S. McGee, Deputy Attorney General, L.J. Warren, Chairman of the Board of Prison Directors, and Dr. Thomas L. Taylor, Superintendent of Waimano Home.
Just so we know the
Okay,
questions
so,
that are.
yeah, a question, and then back over here, so.
Here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Sterilization programs were quite common in the past, but then you remember medical records were not exactly allowed to know everyone's business. The American Indians in their past had a real bad problem. Going back to your eugenics, remember the interracial marriage? A lot of those laws were not struck down until the 1970s. So
Yeah.
when you start talking about all of this, some of that stuff went all the way up until 20th century.
Yeah, and then now it's in the news this week again in Canada with these women being coerced into selecting sterilization in the hospitals.
But you have to remember, we're talking about a period where they didn't have the right. In other words, those sterilizations were
different, yeah.
performed without anyone knowing.
Yeah, totally just doing it, right?
And you won't be able to find most of those records because those are medical records. So I'm not too sure how you're going to find it unless those reporters had interviewed the people who were sterilized.
Well, in Hawaii, it's whoever has the, desire to dive into the medical records here. So I don't know, that's not me, but there's like all kinds of medical archives and stuff here too that has to be explored to take this deeper.
Case study, maybe. I'm not too sure you're going to touch on stuff like that because,
Or get the whole picture.
well, let's face it, these days everyone is sue happy.
Yeah.
And you find out that a bunch of people realizing that they couldn't bear kids and not realizing it was done for their better interests. You
Yeah.
don't think that would open up a can of worms right now? I mean,
Yeah, I'm sure, sure Palama Settlement and Queens Hospital don't want anything to do with that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Did you have a question? Thank you.
I'm a local historian, and this subject has been on my radar for about 20 years. But you're the first person doing a scholarly study on this subject, so thank you
You're welcome.
for doing this. I'm so excited.
It's such an uplifting topic. I don't know why nobody has picked it up yet.
Yeah, and over the years, whenever I've been in the bowels of the State Library looking at microfilm, and I spend most of my time in the 1800s, I've come across numerous articles that have information about breeding of Hawaiians to other ethnic groups. And every time I read one of those, as a Native Hawaiian, I would get so upset. I would have to leave my machine and go outside to catch my breath because I would get so upset. And I read numerous of those, and in the legislature they were talking about it, on the streets they were talking about it. We need to breed the Hawaiians with Samoans, with this group of Germans, and the relative quality of this kind of breeding. It's like they're talking about cattle or horses. And so it's always been upsetting for me. So thank you. And I didn't know about the territorial period because I don't go there as much. But can I read a short excerpt from this book that I just finished reading? It's called Beyond Hawaii, Native labor in the Pacific world, and it talks about some eugenics. Can I read a short passage? Got time? So this is talking about King Kalakaua, and during his time in the 1870s in particular, you have to put it in context. This was a time when sugar plantations were rising, going up, and they're coming to the apex of a lot more plantations, but the labor pool was very short, especially in the Hawaiian community. So there was all this discussion about how can we get more labor into the islands because the Hawaiians don't want to work for us and all these things. So this section is coming out of that context. And it says here, the state also simultaneously held hopes that the Chinese coolies, as biological agents, would do what bodies do best, reproduce. Unlike Southern planters in the United States who worked hard to ensure that black slaves reproduced new slaves for coming generations, the Kingdom of Hawaii did not necessarily want Chinese workers to reproduce more Chinese. Instead, they wanted the Chinese to intermarry with Hawaiians and produce a new super race, a Chinese-Hawaiian amalgam. Pretty disturbing stuff.
So I know we have some expertise in the room around that. Professor Howes or Lorenz, do you guys want to respond or anything to that piece? I mean, because this is really interesting, right? And there's all kinds of things like, well, wait, Ali'i was all about positive eugenics, kind of, like when you think about it. So there's all of these issues and threads of breeding and mating and politics and race, and I'm not prepared to respond to kingdom stuff around that, but please. It's a conversation.
Well, I mean, I guess my response would be that I think I see like the overall pattern being different at that time. I mean, what you talked about today is like in the territory, like the whole point was to put the Hawaiians down and to create this kind of colonial occupational system where, like, you know, to create this kind of white supremacy for the missionary descendants and whatever, and some American new settlers, and keep like this racial hierarchy in place with all these brown people kind of under them. Whereas I think in the kingdom, like if Kalakaua had those kind of eugenic thoughts, if you want to call them, it was more like it was for a very different purpose. It was because he saw like the Hawaiian people dying and coming less and less, and he was thinking about ways of how to make the Hawaiian race not die and remain dominant in the Hawaiian Islands, and have Hawaii not be taken over by other people moving in. So, I mean, even though we might, from today's point of view, see some of this also as very problematic, the way he was talking about breeding people and whatever, but I think the purpose was very different. So that's what I from my knowledge of King Kalakaua and that period and the political goals of the kingdom government, you know, that's, I guess, how I would react to that.
Any other questions?
So the obvious one is Nazis and any connections to Germany during that period. And the second one I want to ask about is kind of off of what Lorenz was talking, this issue of ho'olahui and this, you know, pro-reproduction or counter-reproduction, different contexts. But do you ever come across anything like in terms of queered sexuality or relations which are anti-productive in nature, and do you see any sense of resistance perhaps in the literature that might speak to that? So Nazis and anti-reproduction.
Okay, so first Nazis. So one thing about eugenics research is it's like the map is incredibly vast, and it's expansive in terms of time, and it's vast in terms of just geography and stuff. So I started to kind of map out like where, you know, some of the connections were with the folks who were pushing eugenics in Hawaii and what other like United States associations they were connected to, and trying to, you know, make the connections. But I mean, the only thing that I kind of read in some of the eugenics literature, not Hawaii, but just literature about eugenics, was that, you know, like Hitler kind of ruined it for people. He kind of took it to its for this logic. And, after that, people pushing eugenics had to kind of deal with that a little bit or be a little bit more careful or conservative. So, and then your second question, are you talking about like the territorial eugenics discourse in literature?
Yeah, I'm curious to know what queer sexualities and what they talked about there.
Yeah,
regarding
so
degeneracy.
I think I found an entry point to some of that, but I didn't find any of that because I didn't go super far into it. I sort of touched on it in my thesis as a thread for another person to pick up, but just in terms of sexuality, for men thinking about the Macy case, and eugenics and some of the eugenics legislation comes right on the heels of that as well. And so there's this construction of the Hawaiian male as a sexual threat and sexually violent going on, I think in the territorial period and as part of this. And with women, it was more about promiscuity. So I think that opens up the door for all kinds of, sexuality and, queerness and stuff like that. But and those women were kind of being put into Waimano home. I know that's one place that they were going, where I think the men, it was more, more pushing towards sterilization and sort of this emasculating kind of, I guess, procedure. But I know it's there, but that's not a door that I went far into. But there's definitely this sexuality piece, and the sexuality piece that goes, this discourse goes all the way back, into the kingdom and stuff like that too, about, promiscuous Hawaiian women and whatnot. So, yeah. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to kind of drop into this debate you were having, because you mentioned that about the kind of sexuality of Hawaiian males being considered that. I was just immediately thinking of the Massey case, because that's the period, that's right that time, early 30s. So have any, did you see any kind of discussion the Massey case kind of reinforcing this kind of stuff, this kind of Manoa within Hawaii?
What year is the Massey case?
31.
Yeah, so then that sterilization bill comes out in 33.
Oh, okay.
I think there's a connection there. And when I was in my master's thesis, those connections were a lot clearer. But that's one that I still remember, is that next legislation comes right off of the heels of the Massey case. And there's cartoons, political cartoons that come out during that time that portray, the man of color in sort of a beastly manner and a threatening manner and stuff. So.
Well, even during Lady Uokalani's reign, in Western newspapers, American and British, European newspapers, she is in cartoons portrayed as a member of the Mongoloid race, and so Mongoloid became a very derogatory term, and so our Hawaiians were often called Mongoloid race, and men were, and we're talking about the Massey case, the men were all rapists and degenerates, and that's why the Massey case that's why it happened. Mm-hmm. So it was very prominent. Sure.
So I'm curious about those later bills. The thing that's, excellent talk, really interesting. What's sort of a puzzle in comparison to the mainland cases is that the bills didn't succeed. So they succeed almost uniformly in the United States, and then when Buck v. Bell happens in '54, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's supposed to be the great progressive justice, affirms Buck v. Bell and says the state has a rational interest in sterilization institutions, right? Mm-hmm. That's still standing law in the United States, never been struck down. And so I'm curious, particularly in those later bills where Hawaiian representation is diminishing in the legislature, how they were able to defeat it. Do you know, it really is an anomaly. I don't know of any other states. Illinois passes a sterilization law, all of the Carolinas, Texas, right?
Yeah.
There are very few outliers, and mostly only in intensely Catholic states who didn't like the connection to birth control.
Yeah.
So kind of how they were able to mobilize.
So the 1950 bill, which I think is the last bill, I think
Yeah.
it's 50 or 55, that's basically getting just more and more distant from like my focus. But the one thing that I remember, and I'm gonna actually like lob this over to Craig Howes if you have someone on this, but the one thing that I do remember was that Senator Trask was one of the big vocal opponents to that bill. But I imagine, well, I'm not gonna share what I imagine. Do you have anything to say about that?
Purely speculative, when you're moving into the new democratic Hawaii and the notion of how eugenics was directly related to race, you suddenly had actually a majority in the legislature that would recognize eugenics as being very much tied to Aryan notions of white supremacy, and you actually had a legislature by that point that was basically going the opposite direction. And of course, Arthur Trask was one of the people that was tied in at that particular time, although he ended up sort of on the other side. But there you would have ended up getting a coalition, which would have happened around the Massey case, where suddenly it was in the interests of a whole bunch of people, as you were pointing to, a number of ethnicities concerned about the fact that any kind of medical problem or sort of compelling illness and whatever would be a justification for carrying out another agenda that they had already been seen being carried out in other terms.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, because basically the very fears that they project in that 1903 territorial report totally come true. Like all of those people do become citizens and they do take over politics in Hawaii, and I guess the struggle just continues. It continues today. I mean, that oligarchy still has a lot of power today, but it's also still being resisted today as well. But yeah, that's what I could think of, is there's a connection between the racial makeup of the legislatures and the passage of the bill, or non-passage, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add one further comment in relation to the issue of queer sexuality in the 19th century. Jamaica, Iolani Osorio has just been finishing a doctoral dissertation where one of the things she's pointing out is that sort of compulsory heteronormativity and patriarchal inheritance actually means that the easy transmission of land between generations basically is set up so that it can only pass through heterosexual couples. In other words, that becomes the default for the way that land and property and value is passed. So that if you want to go outside of that, you have to go through a completely separate legal process. And that's not only here, but it's also in Turtle Island. And that business of compulsory heteronormativity also is very much tied to issues of land and property.
I have a question for Terry over here.
Fun.
Terry, you were a good friend of Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell. You worked with him a lot. And he was a student at Kamehameha Schools.
Yes.
And during this early period, and he was still in school there when the World War II broke out. Did he ever talk about that, about this eugenics program, and talk about it in any way that you know of?
I've already heard that word before.
He didn't talk about it to you guys?
Not using that word.
He used that word?
No. I never heard him use that word. Yeah. But all of the legacy of the racism that the founders of Kamehameha Schools was always a topic that we would dive into and try to, understand.
And I know this was a little before his time, and the other thing that I couldn't, because the archives at KS, they don't have every single year, or they didn't when, who's the old archivist? She was? Janet Zisk. So she didn't believe me, first of all, that this was a thing, and she invited me into the archive, and her archive was only organized in her mind. Like, it wasn't something that anybody could go in, but she had it down, right? Like, she was definitely she was in charge of that, and she knew it well. But she didn't believe me about Aldrich Thompson, because Aldrich Thompson has also been really glorified in KS history, and I think he had his own day, kind of like Founders Day, for a long time. And then when I showed her, she was just like totally shocked. But anyways, in my time in the archive, when she was in charge of it, at least, we couldn't find the curriculum books for all of the years. So I also don't know when it ended. Because this time that I'm talking about, when it starts, is definitely before Uncle Keikuni's time. But I'm not sure. He still could have been exposed, but it depends on how far along it was being taught. And although I focus in so narrowly on just like kind of the darkest, you know, the darkest significance of the curriculum, like it's not to say that these Hawaiians were, one, paying attention, or two, like totally internalizing just this curriculum. I think that what Noi touches upon, that the quote that I shared of like this being part of a larger body of work at KS in building and shaping a heteronormative middle class, is probably where this falls into in terms of like the real impact that KS has.
Why haven't you interviewed some of the students from Kamehameha Schools? Some of them are still alive.
Yeah, because I just didn't.
I'm asking not to put any heat on you. You have quite a lot that are still around.
Yeah.
And I know that they're dying off, but then at the same time, some of them are still around.
I'll be on that.
Try the Agard family. Since Buzzy Agard had a brother, John. John's still very much alive.
Mm-hmm.
What are you working on now?
I think it's totally different. I'm looking at, like broadly, I'm looking at women's relationship to land through laws of coverture in the kingdom, through and despite laws of coverture in the kingdom. But it's sort of taken me on a temporary focus on kahumanu. And it's like the funnest thing ever. And we are all, you know, kind of doing similar things. And I'm actually looking at what happens when we decenter Christianity from her narrative, and like all of the story that is allowed to come out when we decenter Christianity, and how it helps us to think of Kanaka institutions of governance. Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm working on now. So, yeah.
I'm just guessing by your age, your parents, what did they think of your research? And did they know anything about it, since I'm assuming you were living on the mainland?
Yeah. So my dad actually went to Kamehameha Schools. So he went to St. Joe in Hilo. And then he got into Kamehameha Schools in 7th grade, and I think he was kicked out by 9th grade. Something about getting the keys to the cafeteria, and my grandma says he got kicked out for stealing a hot dog, and how absurd is that? But anyways, they're super supportive. I mean, my parents are, you know, good old liberals, and now, you know, the story that I told of us not knowing anything growing up, as me and then 2 of my brothers and then my sister like made our way back to Hawaii and sort of naturally got involved in the political spaces as we were in Washington, like it just gave my dad permission, and it was just automatic. We were just all back in it together, and like he's learning for, you know, like with us and through us, and you know, now it's like sovereignty is just a no-brainer and an automatic thing with him and stuff. And so because this, you know, unpacks the questions that we're all asking about what happened with our history, yeah, they're very supportive. And my mom, who's white, is also like, you know, she understands history, and she's not threatened by any of this stuff either.
Can you tell a little bit more about your Long Hawaiian blood? I know a famous Long person in Hawaiian history.
Maui.
Oh, Maui.
I'm the Maui Longs, Wai'ehu.
Who was the first Long?
Captain Thomas Long.
Okay, that's the one guy I know.
Yeah.
Buried in Oahu Cemetery?
Yes.
I know that guy.
Yeah. So he's great grandfather. Yeah. And then his son married my tutu Kauai. And then one of their sons is my great-grandfather, and his son is Chester Long. That's my grandfather. Yeah. Are we related?
No.
Oh. You never know. Yeah.